Just a few more days until Easter, and whether you're Catholic, non-Catholic Christian, non-Catholic, non-Christian, regular average Easter enjoyer, you're probably thinking about God this time of year. And if you are, our conversation with Spencer Klavan is going to be right up your alley. We didn't necessarily talk about the Easter Bunny. We didn't talk about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But we talked about God, the role that God plays in our lives, in science, in theology, and in our own pursuit of truth, whether it's as a leader of our family or building a company. And when you listen to this podcast with Spencer, oh my gosh, one of the smartest guys that we've had on the show, the absolute joy to listen to. I learn something new with each sentence that comes out of his mouth. As you're listening to Spencer share his thoughts, you may be thinking, how does this apply to me as a business owner? Why is Sanger bringing this content to me? I thought this podcast was for business owners who are looking to improve their health, wealth, and relationships. And you'd be right. This podcast is for business owners who want to improve their health, wealth, and relationships. And the number one way to improve your health, your wealth, and your relationships is to root that in an ultimate calling. Whether you're trying to transform your wealth to significance or simply become a better person, having some sort of theological framework rooted in a pursuit of God in whatever way, form, fashion that means to you, that's important. And Spencer will talk about that. So it took us a while to warm up to starting to make connections about what those things are for business owners and why it's important uniquely for you as a business owner to make that pursuit of God's truth or practice in your life. But we get there, so stick with me, and I promise we'll make the connections. You might remember Spencer Klavan from episode 88, Deciding to Save the West. He's a scholar, associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books, and the host of the Young Heretics podcast. He graduated from Yale, earned his doctorate in ancient Greek literature from Oxford University. His deep understanding of the roots of Western civilization make him probably the best person that we could possibly have to come on the podcast to talk about navigating our evolving culture and what we can do to help. His analysis is, hey, things are not going well, but we've faced all of these crises before and overcome them as a people. So he's here to talk about what the things are that we need to do to overcome that again. I'm really excited to introduce to you again on the Decidedly podcast, Spencer Klavan. I'm Sanger Smith, and this is Decidedly. Yeah, I'm glad to have you, man. I want to start off with addressing the controversy that you introduced into my own way of thinking, which is you on the internet the other day, you said you cannot separate the Protestant Revolution from the scientific revolution. And I'm on the far less educated side of the table from you. I'm going to say, how can you credit the Protestant Revolution with the scientific revolution that started clearly with the Catholic Church? Spencer, ready, go.
Oh, boy. Well, you're not wrong that within the major players in the beginning of what we think of as the scientific revolution, for sure, started within the Catholic Church. And one of the big mistakes we make just at the outset that I don't think is one you're guilty of is people tend to think of science and religion as being in this war that somewhere around the 1400s there broke out, right? This war between the church, faith, and religion. And this is based on like a few kind of cherry-picked moments from some spats that Galileo had with the cardinals and the Pope. But they never really tell you the context, which is that Galileo and the Pope were kind of bros. And like Galileo and the Catholic Church both understood themselves very profoundly to be seeking God's glory. This was true of Isaac Newton. It was true of Johannes Kepler. It was true to some extent, although less so, of Francis Bacon. And so you're absolutely right that it's not as if the scientific revolution is a product exclusively of the Protestant church. But the other thing that we have to bear in mind is that the questions people were asking that created the scientific revolution were the same questions that created the Protestant Reformation. And basically the core of it all was, how do we know what truth is? How can we be sure? And what authority can we look to be definitely sure that what we think is true is true? And so the printing press was the technology that really turbocharged that problem. And even though there had been versions of these questions arising in the medieval universities within the Catholic Church, it was only once the kind of centralized authority of the Catholic Church collapsed in the bloody sort of 30 Years' War and all of the things that ensued, that really it became apparent that people were going to have to settle on or try to settle on some new way of like rubber stamping the truth. And that question is what the major players in the like really kind of heat of the scientific revolution were all grappling with. So I mentioned already Kepler and Newton. Descartes is this way. Bacon too, they're all trying to do this. And those guys were all some variety of Protestant operating within the Protestant kind of princedoms that emerged after the 30 Years' War in sort of the wake of the Treaty of Versailles. So I don't think you have, it's not so much that like you don't have the scientific revolution without Protestantism. It's more that the same situation that gave rise to the scientific revolution also gives rise to Protestantism, and the 30 Years' War just really turbocharges the whole thing.
Yeah, so it was the same questions that were being asked. What is truth? What is the truth that we're pursuing? And then to what authority are we going to submit in our pursuit of that truth?
That's right. Yeah. And another guy you have to mention that I haven't listed yet is Descartes, right? We don't think of him necessarily as a scientist because now we've separated out kind of natural science as this specific discipline. But at the time, this was not true at all. And it was all part of natural philosophy. And philosophy itself was kind of this big overarching, like mega discipline. And within that, everybody that wanted to think seriously had to think both about, what's the nature of God, what's our place in the universe, but also, like how do blood vessels work? And is there such a thing as gravity and an ether? And those questions kind of weren't as separate then as they are now. And even the word science was a much broader word encompassing all sorts of disciplines. And yeah, I think that really what you have, there's a writer named Suzanne Langer who people don't read as much anymore, but she talks about philosophy, the tradition of Western philosophy going through key changes like a piece of music. So if you start in the key of C, the music kind of has this one vibe, but then somewhere down the line, you have what's called a modulation. And suddenly you're in the key of E flat minor and everything has gotten sort of sadder and weirder and whatever. And Langer's whole idea is like, philosophy doesn't necessarily make these grand advances so much as it changes key under different historical circumstances. And what it means for philosophy to change key is for people to start gravitating around different primary questions. And so the primary question that kind of emerges when philosophy switches into the key of the scientific revolution, that what is truth question becomes kind of the tonic note, the dominant note of everybody's philosophy, religious and scientific.
Yeah, it seems like all scientific advances up until very, very recent history have begun with a curiosity about the theology, a curiosity about our relationship with God, our existence in the world. And only recently have we begun to separate that. And like you were saying earlier, people nowadays tend to talk about science and religion as two opposing forces. People will often justify their atheism by saying, no, I believe in science.
Yeah, right. Trust the science. Like that's not a God. Yeah.
Yeah, the capital S science. And
Mhm.
it's so funny to me because if you really break down that pursuit of scientific truth far enough, we're going to get to the question of why does it matter anyway for us to seek out these scientific truths. And it's difficult, I think, to root that pursuit of scientific truth in an atheistic worldview. And the modern atheists present this and say, look at all of the things that we've done as science, and discounting that started with a pursuit of God in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, much like all major mistakes in philosophy, this is French people's fault. So, like, what you have is,
for sure,
as you indicate, right, it almost doesn't make any sense at all to do science unless you have some kind of, I definitely wouldn't say Christian worldview. There have been people who aren't Christians that do very coherent science and make major advances, but theistic worldview that locates the source of order and reason and even existence outside of the material world. And if you think about it for a second, you'll see why this is, because if it's one thing for me to start asking questions like, what are the rules that govern the motion of the planets? And maybe even like how are those rules related to the way that like apples fall to the ground? But it's another thing for me to expect those questions to have answers, because the question is just something that came up in my head. It's related to my experience of the world. And if I'm just an accident among accidents and a bunch of molecules bouncing off each other, then why should anything that comes up in my head have any relationship to the structure of places I've never been before, time that has not yet happened, distances far beyond what I'm capable of traveling? And yet, innately, we just automatically expect that there is this order in the universe. In fact, that's what the word cosmos means. When we talk about the universe as a cosmos, that's from a Greek word kosmeo, meaning to put into order. It's actually where we get our word cosmetics, right? So this idea of like symmetry, beauty, harmony, you have to have that idea in order to confidently proceed with the assumptions that are behind science. And science can't prove these assumptions. It's based on those assumptions. And so for most of the history of natural philosophy and then now what we call science, people were deeply convinced that what they were doing was uncovering an order that it already existed in the world. And order is a thing that is not material. It's mental. It's just something that you have in your mind or you plan out in a consciousness. So it follows that, like people like Newton said, I'm looking at the phenomena, the experiences of my senses that I can perceive in the world, and I'm using those to reveal the underlying nature of the mind that built the universe. He was so good at this and did this so effectively, right, that he famously kind of revolutionized the field, came up with these basic rules that can predict and describe all of our observations basically at the human level. They start to kind of wobble and break down once you get really, really big or really, really small, but he didn't know that. And so it looked for a time like every observable phenomenon could be accounted for by Newton's laws. Once this starts to spread, this revelation, this discovery, you get a new generation of people kind of focused in France and closely tied to things like the French Revolution, especially men like Pierre-Simon Laplace, who was France's greatest astrophysicist in the 18th century. These guys who will just say, oh, so we can predict and describe every physical observation, which means that we can predict and describe everything, and we don't need any reference to God. There's a famous sort of urban legend, although it may really be true, that when Napoleon summoned Laplace and asked him why he never talked about God, he said, I have no need of that hypothesis. It's not relevant to anything that I can predict with my calculations, and I can predict everything with my calculations. So that's when you start to get this idea, which is now in its like apogee, that to do science is to just, make religion obsolete. But that's basically just standing on the shoulders of giants and saying that you're floating in midair. It's like saying, I look how far I can see, I must be able to fly. But those questions about kind of God and the structure of the universe and all that, those have to be taken for granted before any of those other answers make sense. And I think now what you're seeing, as you kind of indicated, is the exhaustion of that French interpretation of Newton, that idea has just failed to account for all of human life. And you increasingly need to ask those big questions about metaphysics and God, even to make sense of what physics is discovering. Things like quantum physics, where you get into the role of the conscious observer in reality and in existence. Suddenly you have to do philosophy again. And all of these scientists are saying, no, like, don't just shut up and calculate. Like, don't look at the philosophy, because that will overcomplicate matters. But I mean, you have to start asking these philosophical questions, or else everything falls apart.
Yeah, it seems like everything is going to ultimately start with and get back to God. Funny how that works. But
right.
When you say this has failed, this idea or attempt to separate scientific pursuit from theology, which is the first science, it's clear to you and to me that it has failed. But by what measures do you see that it's failed?
Yeah, well, this is sort of the subject of my new book that's coming out. It's called Light of the Mind, Light of the World, and it's about the journey. I mean, it's kind of about everything we've been talking about, the journey from God to science, and then through science away from God, and then now I think through science kind of back to God. So here's what I'd say. One thing that has really struck me recently is how quickly what was called the new atheism went out of date. So at the real high noon of the supposed triumph of materialist science, you had these guys called the new atheists, men like, Dawkins and Sam Harris, and there were sort of a number of them. The greatest of them, I think, was Christopher Hitchens, who passed away tragically early. But they all had this idea that you could just be rational. I mean, it was kind of like this new Enlightenment idea taken straight from that period when you have the French Revolution and all that, it's just reason. It's just pure human reason that's going to make sense of the world. And leaving aside for a second the incoherence of that position philosophically, it's kind of amazing that nobody ever talks about those guys anymore. And in fact, the supposed enlightened secularism that they predicted would be kind of our new operating system for society has totally broken down. And for that, you just have to look around and see the way that people are kneeling and begging for absolution at political protests, talking about things like systemic racism, which is just a form of original sin, the rise of neo-astrology and crystal therapy. And I mean, people en masse are turning not just to religion, but to the most primitive forms of spirituality that you can identify in Stone Age texts. I mean, T.S. Eliot, the great modernist poet, talks about how all of this stuff, watching the horoscopes and, trying to interpret people's dreams, these are staples of human life, and we're reverting back to them because the idea that we're just a collection of atoms has generated, has been really sterile. And so people are looking at this and they're saying, okay, if I'm just a collection of atoms, I just need to take pills to fix my spiritual problems, which is not working. People are taking more and more of these antidepressants and feeling worse and worse. Depression and suicide and all this is, on the rise. Meanwhile, we talked earlier about the science, capital S, and the way in which COVID sort of revealed this weird reverential and spiritualist tone, even to the so-called secular rationalist mindset. And the only other option that people see on the table is like this techno religion, where we're going to leave our humanity behind and upload our consciousness to the cloud and attain some kind of enlightenment that way. All of these seem like really crazy and flawed approaches to me, but none of them looks like a secular approach. Like the secular approach is just not even on the table anymore. Even when people say they're taking the secular approach, what they're actually doing is making a god or a religion out of science, reason, and so forth. So I'm not a Pollyanna about like, oh, we're all about to go back to church and become, card-carrying Christians or whatever. But I think the idea that we were all going to just like increasingly order our lives in this rational, progressive way has broken down. And the more furiously people try to cling to it, the more wildly it spins out of control.
So I'm pursuing, in my own pursuit of these questions, through my lens of working with business owners on implementing their own, vision for themselves and their families and their companies financially. Ultimately, through a lot of work, I found the conclusion is if your business and your own personal financial life are not rooted in an attempt to serve God, it's ultimately meaningless, and you're going to find some smaller aim that's not going to motivate you through the decades and through life's changes. And when it gets hard, it's going to be much easier to quit. If you root your business's success on money, or success on God instead of money, if you root your life's journey on a pursuit of God instead of a pursuit of that next financial goal, then you're going to be in a better place. And it encourages me to see as a society us move closer to God, where it, at least seems like that's what's happening. I'm observing something similar to what you're describing, is that we're coming closer to God. And I think that's good for leaders to be in a position to say, hey, ultimately what we're going to move with, our widget company, somehow we've got to figure out how does this widget company serve God. And it doesn't mean that like we have prayers in the company cafeteria every Wednesday, although I guess it could. It means that we've got to root what we're doing, our why, our own purpose, has to be in something bigger than just making more widgets and selling more things. And if it is, eventually we try to build the biggest and the biggest and the biggest aim, we're going to get to God. And that's a good thing. So what do you see as like the catalyst for us to continue through this tipping point where the new age atheists are kind of, becoming less interesting to us, but we're also finding these new religions that aren't fulfilling? People are going to find out that they're unfulfilling. How do we get our society to not go down the wrong pursuit of a spiritual connection and instead go down a more fulfilling one?
Well, that's a great question. And your point about people realizing that money is not sort of the highest purpose in life is a great practical example of what I'm talking about, because that's like one of the most ancient sort of truisms, right? I mean, you get it in the Old Testament, if money comes, put not your trust in it. There's the story in the New Testament about that guy that just gathers all this stuff into barns, and he collects as much grain as he possibly can. And he has like every material comfort he could need to live a long life and never have to work again. And he says to himself, it's one of the funniest scenes in the New Testament. He says to his own soul, you have everything you need now to be happy. And you can almost hear him like trying to convince his soul to shut up, because it's obviously not true. Like it's obvious cope. And then to top it all off, a voice comes from heaven and says, you fool, this very moment, your life shall be taken from you. And then, of course, that's where you get the idea that you can't take it with you. So people do reach that stage where they have everything they need, and then they turn to their soul and they say, so come on, soul, like what more do you want? And the soul answers, God, I want God, right? There's just something that's totally unsatisfying about even when you do satisfy all your material needs, you realize that there's something more that you were always seeking that is higher than that's beyond this kind of material comfort. And then, as you indicate, that's the moment of greatest possibility, but also the moment of some danger, because if you're going to turn now to a spiritual path from a path that was not previously spiritual, you might turn to God, or you might turn to like voodoo or something really weird and gross. And that is kind of on the table now too for people. Here is what I would say. Russell Brand, I don't know if you follow him at all, but he is this very kind of eloquent and kooky British guy that does these big YouTube videos, really famous. And he had this moment where he went online and he said, I've been meditating for a long time. And I have this practice where I kind of try to access the inner stillness within, or the energy flowing through the world, or whatever new agey stuff, And he said, but I've started wearing a crucifix because I figured as long as I'm talking to the energy, I ought to be talking to a consciousness, that is within, maybe it's within my soul, or I'm making contact with it within my soul, but I ought to be talking to somebody on the other end of the line. And this was greeted with some excitement from Christians, but also a lot of people were like, nah, like it's still just new age spiritualism, bro. Like it's still, as if like there's some line somewhere that Russell Brand like failed to cross, And this line is where on one end there's bad theology, and on the other end of the line there is like, you sorted it all out, like wipe your hands, got the right answer to the game show, you call upon the name of Jesus and you do the right things and you go to the right church, and then you've crossed that line. But Russell Brand really like failed to cross that line. And so I think the first question that people like us who are Christians and want to evangelize have to ask is like, if we want to draw that line, are we so sure that we've crossed that line? Because there's not a single denomination I know that doesn't count as a heresy in the light of other denominations that think it's like not far enough toward whatever the perfect theology. And I contrast that attitude with the attitude of the angels as described in the gospel. When one sinner is saved, repents of his sins, we're told there is rejoicing in heaven among the angels, right, who are seated next to God and behold him directly. And what I want to ask is like, do you think that what the angels are up there saying is, hooray, this guy that just converted to Christianity now knows everything that I know about God. Like this person is now just as informed theologically as
and
I,
thankfully
the
he's a
Archangel
Methodist.
Yeah, thank God, right? Thank God he didn't swerve into among those like Baptists, right? No, like the angels are at a nigh on infinite remove from us in terms of their knowledge of God, their intimacy with him, their understanding of him. They know things that we don't even have tongues to express about God, and yet they're over the moon to see us take the crucial step of, accepting Christ, repenting of our sins and seeking forgiveness and all that stuff. If the angels can behave that way, then surely we can look at somebody like Russell Brand and say, hallelujah, like he took a step from this weird contentless spiritualism toward, a personal relationship with God. And so his direction of travel is now the same as yours. And maybe there are some lines you want to draw about when you're like really officially count as a Christian or whatever, but it would be a very boring world if that happened and then we never ever had any progress to make toward God ourselves. Like, no, we are on this infinite road that begins with our first act of repentance and doesn't end until like we are seated among the heavenlies. And even then there are like hierarchies upon hierarchies of angels, like inviting us further up and higher up and deeper in. So all I'm saying is if we want to shape this moment and guide people's decision-making in a time when they're more open to faith than maybe they have been in the past, if we want to do that, then we need to be focusing much less on the finish line we're imposing on people and much more on the direction of travel, meeting people where they are, which might be kind of minimal, and asking what's the next step down that line, because that's, I think, a better way of framing it.
It seems like most individual Christians are a lot more narrow in their application of defined Christianity than any of the creeds. Take the Apostles' Creed, for example. It's actually pretty simple. I believe in one God, creator of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his only son. And then it goes through a few things. He was born in this way, died in this way, etc., crucified, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And the question of whether, Calvinism is true or not is not really addressed. The question of whether or not I need to kneel in the pews or we can have electric guitar worship music at church, not really addressed. The form of liturgy, not addressed. There's a lot of things that are not addressed. There's a lot of theological questions that are not addressed. The basics are there. But when you ask individuals whether they define themselves as a Catholic, a Methodist, a Baptist, a quote-unquote non-denominational, whatever it is, it seems like individuals are a lot more quickly to say, well, that's not real Christianity. Well, you can tell that Sanger's not a real Christian because of this. You can tell that, well, if you can't be a Christian and still do that thing, and, I think I agree with you, that's not helpful. We ought to root our faith in some creed. There should be some statement of faith that we can agree on, and maybe those are different from church to church, which they are. That's fine. Yeah. But I would say most current denominations, still fit within the creeds, depending upon how you view the word Catholic in that. And all Protestants are going to say, well, it's lowercase Catholic, so we just, we're not really focused on the Catholic Church. We're focused on the united part of that word. But other than that, we're good. And okay, I give it to you. I think we're good. Right. So I can see someone like Russell Brand say, okay, maybe he could read the Apostles' Creed and say, no, I don't get on board with this. I'm not 100% on board with the Apostles' Creed. Okay, fine. If that means you're not a Christian, by our litmus test, he might agree with that too. But I'm still thrilled to see someone take one step, even if it's a small one, towards a closer pursuit of the truth, because I'm confident that one day, when I do die, I am going to learn very quickly that I didn't know nearly as much as I thought I did. I'm going to learn real quickly that there's a lot of things that I was focused on that really didn't matter. And I don't know what those are yet, but we'll find out.
Sure will. I mean, I definitely think, historically, a lot of those creeds that you refer to were designed for exactly this purpose. They were designed because, our generation didn't make up bitter infighting over minor points of theology. Like, that is not a novelty. In fact, it's a Christian staple that's like as old, it's as American as apple pie and as Christian as potlucks on Sunday. And often especially the history of the Eastern Roman Empire, but also in the history of the Catholic Church, some authority figure, be it the Pope or the Emperor or one of the major bishops, had to step in and say, look, okay, let's hammer out a bare minimum that we can all agree on. And people talk now as if, heresy, the condemnation of heresy or the excommunication of heretics was some sort of, small-minded, punitive, angry thing that the Christian church did. And I'm not going to put myself on the hook for every bishop that ever lived and say that they were all perfect in their hearts. But in its essence, this practice of defining heresy was not at all so that you could exclude people. It was so that we could just settle on a baseline and then allow for all of the different discussions and disputes that will emerge sort of within that. So now, when you look at somebody like Russell Brand or Ayaan Hirsi Ali is another person that comes to mind. She recently became explicitly a Christian. And she talked, when she explained why, she talked a lot about the cultural role of Christianity and the fact that Christianity has been a civilizing force, and that you can't actually do what she was doing earlier, which is just sort of take the values out of Christianity and use those values but not believe in God. Like the kind of underlying metaphysics is part of the grounding of it. And even then people were like, well, this is cultural Christianity. Like this isn't, real official Christianity. And my feeling is like, okay, so if you ever meet Ayaan Hirsi Ali, like talk to her about that. If you've got people in your life, people that you're advising, Sanger, in their business or whatever, that want your counsel on this, like you are free to have that discussion.
Yeah.
But like when Brand is moving in that direction, it just seems like a big self-own, honestly, to be like, well, that's not enough, instead of like, this is a movement in the right direction. C.S. Lewis writes about how he came out of atheism into Christianity, but on the way he went to like sort of a romantic, capital R romantic form of deism, essentially. Yeah. And he said it was what I needed. It was lifting me up to the next stage. And so, yeah, Russell Brand maybe doesn't believe in every word of the Nicene Creed just yet, but wait and like talk to him about it, see what happens. But you're never going to get to having that conversation if you shut it down immediately by like insisting that he accept the like perpetual virginity of Mary right this second or whatever.
Yeah. How familiar are you with James Fowler's Stages of Faith Development?
No, very little. Please enlighten me.
So I think about his work a lot because he articulates 6 different stages of faith development, and most of us progress through these stages as we age. Right? Very early on, we basically can't understand anything other than the basic stories. Right? Noah's Ark was a thing because it was going to rain, so we had to have the ark to keep the animals alive. And then as we get older, we start to have more of a relationship with the depths of the stories and say, okay, well, it wasn't just about saving the animals. It's about I'm going to have a flood in my own life and I need to prepare for that flood. And so we learn and we get a deeper relationship with it. But around stage 3 is an inability to think beyond the anthropomorphized view of God. And I think this is a really critical stage, because to move to stage 4, where we have more personal responsibility with our own faith relationship, it requires a changing in how we view the nature of God itself. And a lot of people don't do that. They don't move past, and they stay in the church with a rudimentary faith relationship themselves because they're in a community where that's the norm and they just can't leave the church. Hey, maybe they grew up like I grew up. Leaving the church is just not an option. When I meet someone for the first time, it's, what's your name? Where'd you go to school? Where do you go to church? Not if you go, it's where did you go? And when you live in the South, you can't just not go to church. So I'm going to stay in, but maybe I don't really care anymore. I'm just going on Sundays. Some people leave, and they leave when they're at this stage of the faith development, and then they exist outside of the church, critical of the church, assuming that everybody who remains in the church is at that same level of faith understanding that they were when they left at age 15. And so what I think is true is that beliefs are hard to change, and our beliefs are important to us. So when those beliefs get challenged, people who are in general are going to react negatively on the onset. And it takes a high level of self-awareness to not do that, to recognize that, hey, if Spencer and I disagree, that's okay. That doesn't make my beliefs any less valid. It doesn't threaten me that the smart guy that I'm talking to believes something different than me. It doesn't mean that I'm necessarily wrong. But when I'm at a low stage of faith development, also, I got to shut that down. I got to shut that down. And I think that's where the loudest voices are coming from, is people who haven't explored that faith development journey for themselves, who are maybe not accepting personal responsibility for their own faith. And so they don't want to allow you to exist outside of their framework. As an adult convert to the Catholic Church, I had this experience a lot. when people would find out, oh, you're Catholic now, their immediate response is to tell me the things that they don't agree with about the Catholic Church. Not to say, why did you do that? What was that journey like? What brought you there? How long did it take? Nothing. It's just, well, I just can't get past the Mary thing. Oh, that's great. We were talking about me, but I
homies be out on the internet refighting the 30 Years' War. Like, it's wild out there, you know? I mean, you would think that in an era where like rival faiths are arising to basically like, you know, erase our humanity and pack us away into like meat boxes and turn us all into cyborgs, that people who basically agree in God and like even better, like believe in his incarnate son, could sort of just like put their differences aside or discuss those differences like in, you know, over drinks at the club at some point or something. No. Like the intensity with which, the narcissism of small differences with which people will like condemn. I mean, I'm sure you get this way worse than I do because you're a Catholic, and that's the Mary thing. Oh my gosh, you know. I've recently been talking on my podcast about how the veneration of icons is actually makes a lot of sense. You know, you don't have to do it. I'm not telling people like this is a necessary ingredient in Christianity, but like it's not the same thing as idol worship, and here's why. And it is. Yeah. It's just like, you know, like total, you know, log jam, glitch, freeze, does not compute. But this is such an important point, not just for evangelism, actually, but for like any kind of influence that you want to have in anybody's life, if it's your employee or your kid or whatever. I just think this is like a huge thing to internalize and understand. You know, we go out there and we want to spread the faith and we think it's part of our responsibility. And so we imagine that what that means is we've been appointed by God to make correct arguments and have correct theology and like own people with facts and logic. And if you can just like really, you know, convince somebody in, you know, 280 characters or less, or like, you know, in whatever interaction you're having right now, like you must explain the Nicene Creed point by point to them, or else you have failed. And that creates this incredibly tense, stilted, and like ultimately really counterproductive sort of conversation that we have all the time. And I think the secret to that is like, there is such a thing as a person that hears an argument for God and reads deeply and considers carefully and is rationally converted to that does happen. And I believe there are good arguments for God. But to exactly what you were saying, like most people, even good, virtuous people, are not profoundly, you know, open at all times to reevaluating their core premises. Like most of us have maybe, if we're lucky, like 2 or 3 moments in life where we are emotionally at a place where we're open to like really seriously re-examining our core beliefs. And it often comes when we're at our lowest or when we've really been shaken by something terrible or upsetting. And once you realize that, then you realize that actually your job as an evangelist or as an influencer or as a leader, a mentor in somebody's life is to be the guy that person feels comfortable coming to in that moment of vulnerability, which means playing the long game and building relationships and actually, you know, making space for people, including and especially when they disagree. Like it's really hard just baseline as a Christian to convince somebody who's not a Christian that you don't condemn them, that you're not going to like, you know, denounce them to hell for every problem they have. And so what you're really in the business of doing as an evangelist, as a mentor, whatever, is projecting to people and forming the relationship with people where when they are in that moment where their heart is crying out for meaning and something has fallen out from underneath them, like you're the person they might call at 2 a.m. when they're just really not sure how they can go on. And then you make your move. Then you speak from the heart. Because like otherwise, I don't know, man. Like, listen, I make arguments for a living. I'm a professional nerd. But even I don't believe in like convincing people with facts and logic that much. Like, that's just not how the human heart works.
Yeah. It's rare that works, and I think for most people, if you ask them and say, "Hey, have you ever been convinced in that way?" they're gonna immediately realize, "Oh, I guess not," and that's not how I arrived at. I didn't read a handbook on the precepts of the Catholic Church and go, "Oh, you know what? This does seem more correct." It was some version of what Ian Hersey Ali and Russell Brand and anybody else who's had a faith transformation in life has gone through, which is to say, I'm looking for something that I'm not currently getting, and I don't exactly know what that thing is or where to get it. And then eventually you find it. And I think that it's good to find it in the one true God who gave us his incarnate son. And that's a great starting point. And beyond that, the way that you worship on Sundays, what type of music they play, what your favorite books are, whether, you like the writings of Peter or Paul more, hey, I don't think that those are necessarily the main points we need to focus on, because you're right. The transformation that our world is flirting with, whether, the metaverse and AI are so antithetical to what our faith is and what our faith says is important. I've been studying Pope John Paul II's The Theology of the Body recently, which is based on his writings and homilies in, I think, the 70s. And it's so clear what makes us human is the relationship of the soul and the body, the mind, the soul, and the spirit together, or the mind, the spirit, and the body together. And we're divorcing that through a lot of modern problems, but that one, the AI world that is becoming more and more a focus in our everyday life, that's the scariest to me, because it erodes the entire foundation of the faith that's gotten us to this point as a society.
Yeah, very well put. I mean, the tech stuff to me is at once terrifying and also sort of fascinating. Like, it's the place where if we lived with a more confident church, people would be rushing in to do what used to be called natural theology about this stuff. Like, it used to be that the church was deeply engaged, as we started out talking about, the church was deeply engaged with the latest in scientific advances because they were held and understood to carry intimations of God, but also, great import and weight and moral consequence for how people lived. And as you say, especially those that touch upon our embodied nature as human souls, like, nothing could be of greater merit or importance. And I kind of feel like, as Christians, as and what we're hearing from our church leaders is often just like, no, bad, right? Like, don't do that. And I feel that is insufficient, because first of all, like, don't do what? Like, which technologies are you saying are awful, and which technologies are? I mean, like, I understand that ChatGPT is very scary because it can sort of pretend to be a human and might eventually convince people that it's a human, but it's just a chatbot, right? I mean, it's just a software basically for very advanced, sophisticated predictive text. So when we say, like, don't do AI, do we mean don't do predictive text? Like, how far back does that go?
Yeah, what is AI? Because it's a computer program. When the computer chess program beat a human player back in the 70s. Yeah. At the time, that was, oh my gosh, computers going to take over the world immediately. And obviously that didn't happen.
No, because humans are the point. Because nobody wants to see two computers play chess. Nobody wants actually, I mean, it remains to be seen whether people want, for example, to watch a movie that was made exclusively by a computer. But if you do, you'll be fundamentally doing a totally different thing than when you watch a movie now. You'll be looking at what what some guy could make a computer do. Like, nobody in their heart of hearts actually cares what the computer can do. We care what people can do with computers. And there is, I think, kind of a white pill that you can take here where you say, yeah, there's a hideously dystopian philosophy at work in a lot of these technologies, but there's also a lot of kind of baked in good intuition that people have, that our technology is there to enable and to, in some senses, restore us where we are broken. It's not there to replace us. And the idea that it's there to replace us is really what I think Christians ought to be fighting against, not like ChatGPT can talk, and so now it's going to use the aluminum in our bodies to make paper clips. Like, I think that's like, you know.
And if you want to take the position as a business owner that we're not going to use AI, and you need to be prepared to go full Amish within the next few years, because you're just not going to be able to compete. And you're going to have to apply that logic backwards and ultimately get rid of your computers and get rid of your light bulbs. Like, eventually you're going to have to recognize there's no amount of healthy technology, because where are you going to draw the line? And if that's based on predictive computing, we passed that a while back. We passed that line a while back.
Right. No, it's you I think put your finger on it when you talk about John Paul's theology of the body. Like, it's about our humanity, right? It's not about which technologies we think are Satan and which ones aren't. Like, all technologies are both tools of Satan and tools of God, because they're just tools. And so they're, you know, people have always felt apocalyptic about new tech, and they've always had good reason to, and been in some ways kind of right. And yet there's no safe option here, because tech is just an extension of us acting in the world. And us acting in the world is what carries that inherently ambivalent moral weight that it can be both good and evil. And ultimately, the reason that's true is because we were endowed with free will, because in order to love God and one another, we have to have free will, or else the love isn't real. And in order to have free will, you have to be able to sin. And like, you really just chase it back down to the root of like the fall and sin. And in the end, what that means is like, your problem is spiritual. Your problem is not, in fact, any one technology. And like, you probably need instead to be doing more serious thinking about the kinds of questions you were asking, like, what is the purpose of this widget making company? Why do you want to make it? And how ultimately does it glorify God and therefore bless humanity?
What gives you the most optimism that we are going to actually start going that way as a culture?
Boy, I mean, I've talked a little bit about this before. I am neither an optimist nor a pessimist, because I think both optimism and pessimism are predictions about the future, which I don't know. But I am a hope supremacist. I am, as they might say online, average hope enjoyer, because hope is one of the three primary Christian virtues. And I think it's actually a commandment. Like, it's a necessity that we seek hope and have hope. And my hope is in the natural yearning of the human heart for God. That's where I'm placing my hope, because a lot of what we've been talking about, from the boardroom up to like the, you know, AI tech stuff, has to do with the fact that you can yell at people, you can threaten them, you can call them all sorts of nasty names, you can even oppress them politically, but you cannot stamp out that longing for God. In fact, often by trying to stamp it out, you only make it burn more intensely. That's what happened in the Soviet Union as the Russian people became more and more desperate for the God that they had been denied. I just think that, like, you know, when you come to me and tell me that AI is going to usher in the age of Terminator and we're all going to be turned into batteries for our machines, I'm like, maybe they definitely want to do that, but also, like, you're first going to have to convince people that a fake dummy actress made out of code is better than a real life person communicating to you from the depths of her soul. And I'm hopeful that that's actually not all that convincing itself.
Reading any articles that have been completely generated by ChatGPT, that'll make me pretty optimistic, because along the lines of what you're saying is people are going to recognize that it's not really what we wanted,
Right.
like cake for breakfast or something.
No, it's by definition, it's middle of the road.
Yeah. What would you say is your final decision-making tip for business owners?
I guess I would say, ask yourself the question of the telos. This is an old Greek idea. The word telos just means highest purpose or final end, final cause. And Aristotle has 4 causes that he talks about, things that, four different things that cause events to occur. And they're actually all kind of useful tools for thinking about like business decisions, for example. So there's the material cause, which is just the basic, the cause of the chair existing is the wood that it's made out of. So that would be like thinking about your initial capital investment, your startup money, whatever. Like, what resources do you have available? What people, what objects do you have available to build this thing? There's the efficient cause, which is the kind of person or thing that serves as the catalyst for the activity. So like, who's the driver here? Like, who's the CEO? Who's the entrepreneur? Who's the person whose idea is kind of making this thing happen? There's the formal cause, which is like, how is the structure going to dictate what we do? So if you can picture the thing complete, how are you going to get from where you are now to that complete thing? And so all of those are actually good things, I think, to be thinking about for making decisions. But the question you can't forget to ask yourself when you're making your decision is, what's the final cause? What's the purpose or the reason for this thing to exist at all? And so I would say, if you're facing big decisions, you might go run down that checklist. Start with the material cause. What sort of resources, physical resources do I have? Can I get for myself? Go through the efficient and the formal cause, but don't forget ultimately to ask your final cause question. What is the point of it all?
What's the final cause? Thanks for being here, man. Where can people connect with you and the work that you're doing?
So the easiest kind of one-stop shop is probably my Twitter. For my sins, I am still on Twitter, or I guess X. It's at Spencer Klavan. And there you will find a bunch of stuff. But one thing you will find that I really hope people will check out is my new book, which is coming out. I mentioned it earlier, Light of the Mind, Light of the World. It's coming out on August 13th. And it is very directly related to basically everything we've been talking about, but especially the return of God into science and into the world. And you can pre-order it now, basically wherever there are books. Simon & Schuster has it up on their website. You can get it at Amazon, wherever books are sold.
Sweet. So pre-order it now. I'm excited for it. Thanks for coming, man.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
My biggest takeaway from our conversation with Spencer is that my job as a leader in my company is to be the guy that people feel comfortable coming to when they are at a point of vulnerability. And that's especially true when they disagree. So we talked about religious, theological disagreements. When people disagree with my company, sometimes they're going to disagree with the things that I've done, the decisions that I've made. I want them to be the person, I want them to feel comfortable hearing that. And the biggest thing that I can do is to have a humble opinion, or a humble view, humble understanding, not think that I'm always right. Just like if I'm talking to a Methodist or a Lutheran or a Baptist, I'm not going to spend my whole conversation about their beliefs, criticizing them and telling them why they're wrong. I want to seek to understand why they believe what they believe. And if I can do that with my employees, instead of seeking to correct or seeking to inform or seeking to be understood, if I can seek to understand why they're dissatisfied, why they're cautious, why they're angry, why they're optimistic, then I can be a better leader and I can get them to share things that they would otherwise keep hidden.
You just made a great decision to listen to this episode of Decidedly. Make another great decision and leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts. We appreciate your support. It helps others find our community and defeat bad decision-making in their own lives. For more daily decision-making insights, check us out at decidedlypodcast.com and on Facebook and Instagram at Decidedly Podcast. Thanks again for listening. I'm Sanger Smith, and this is Decidedly.
Insights, advice, and comments provided by Sean Smith, Sanger Smith, and speakers identified as part of the Decidedly podcast should not be considered recommendations. Speakers not identified as members of Decidedly are expressing their opinion, and their statements should not be construed as reflecting the views of the Decidedly team. This podcast is produced solely for informational purposes, not personalized advice.